Did you know that in about 5 minutes, the entire course of the war in the Pacific changed forever? 5 minutes. That's how long it took for American dive bombers to hit three Japanese aircraft carriers, turning them into blazing wrecks. It was a moment of stunning, almost unbelievable reversal. Before that morning, on June 4th, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was the most powerful, dominant naval force on the planet. They had not lost a major battle in generations. After those 5 minutes, they were on a path to total defeat. How could such a thing happen? How could a navy that had crushed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, sunk the pride of the British fleet, and conquered a vast empire be so utterly humbled in a single morning? The Battle of Midway wasn't just another battle, it was the turning point. But why? What made this one engagement so much more important than the dozens of others fought across the vast Pacific? It wasn't just about sinking ships, it was about breaking a mindset, shattering a myth, and changing the very rules of warfare. It was a story of incredible intelligence, desperate courage, fatal arrogance, and pure dumb luck. It's a battle where a handful of men, flying fragile planes, made decisions in a split second that decided the fate of millions. Why do historians still argue about a single pilot's turn? Why was the loss of a few hundred veteran pilots just as devastating as the loss of four giant aircraft carriers? Let's look at the reasons this one battle was so astonishingly, fundamentally important. At number 15, was this a battle Japan never even needed to fight? To understand Midway's importance, you first have to understand its insanity. From a purely strategic standpoint, the Japanese attack on Midway Atoll was a massive, unforced error. It was a solution to a problem that didn't really exist, and a gamble that risked the core of their military power for a prize of questionable value. Think about Japan's situation in May of 1942. In 6 short months, they had achieved everything they set out to do, and more. Their initial war plan, as laid out before the Pearl Harbor attack, was to seize the southern resource area. This meant capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies to secure the oil, rubber, and tin they needed to fuel their empire. They did this with shocking speed and efficiency. By the spring of 1942, their defensive perimeter was established. They had what they wanted. The logical next step, argued by many in the Japanese military, was to consolidate, dig in, and fortify this new vast empire. The idea was to make it so costly for the Americans to fight their way back across the Pacific that the U.S. would eventually sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan in control of its new possessions. This was a plausible, if grim, strategy. But one man disagreed. Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet, was haunted by what he had failed to do at Pearl Harbor. His attack had been a stunning tactical success, but a strategic failure. He had sunk battleships, but the American aircraft carriers, the ships he knew were the real threat, had been at sea and escaped untouched. Yamamoto was a brilliant but obsessive man. He was convinced that Japan could not win a long protracted war against the industrial might of the United States. He believed Japan's only hope was to force one more decisive battle, a naval Gettysburg, that would annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet and break American morale, forcing them to the negotiating table. This concept of the Kantai-Kessen, or decisive battle, was deeply ingrained in the Imperial Japanese Navy's doctrine, stemming from their legendary victory over the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. Yamamoto's target for this decisive battle was Midway. His plan was incredibly complex. It involved multiple fleets converging from different directions, including a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, to lure the American carriers into a trap where they could be destroyed. This plan was met with significant resistance from the Imperial General Headquarters. They saw it as a reckless diversion of resources. They wanted to continue pressing south, perhaps towards Australia or into the Indian Ocean. What changed their minds? A single event on April 18th, 1942, the Doolittle Raid, when 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, appeared over Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological damage was immense. It was a profound humiliation for the Japanese military, who had promised the emperor that the Sacred Home Islands would never be touched. Yamamoto seized on this embarrassment. He argued that the Doolittle Raid proved his point. The American carriers were a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, and they had to be eliminated, whatever the cost. The Midway operation was his answer. The opposition crumbled, and his overly complex, high-risk plan was approved. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 should have been another warning sign. Though tactically a mixed bag, it was a strategic setback for Japan. They lost a light carrier and had two of their best fleet carriers, Shikaku and Zuikaku, damaged or depleted of their air crews, making them unavailable for Midway. A more cautious commander might have reconsidered. Yamamoto did not. He pushed ahead, convinced his plan was foolproof and that the Americans would react exactly as he predicted. He was betting his entire empire on a single roll of the dice, a roll he didn't even need to make. This is the first and perhaps most fundamental reason for Midway's importance. It was a battle born of hubris. It was an unnecessary war, a strategic overreach that risked the core of Japan's offensive power on a complex plan that was doomed from the start because its central premise, sea surprise, had already been lost. But what do we still not know? To what extent was Yamamoto's push for the Midway operation a rational strategic calculation versus a personal obsession to fix his mistake at Pearl Harbor? You know, if the Doolittle Raid had been scrubbed due to weather or technical failure, would the Imperial General Headquarters have successfully blocked the Midway plan, leading Japan to pursue a more conservative defensive strategy? And could a simpler Japanese plan, one that didn't divide its forces with the Aleutian diversion, have succeeded at Midway, even if the Americans knew they were coming? Number 14, could a single codebreaker really change the world? The Battle of Midway was won in a windowless, stuffy basement in Hawaii long before the first plane took off. It was a victory not of guns, but of brains. The story centers on a brilliant, eccentric, and insubordinate U.S. Navy officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort. He and his team at Station Hypo, the combat intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, were the heroes nobody saw. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was desperate to understand Japanese intentions. The key was JN-25, the main operational code used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. You know, it was a complex code, but Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and even musicians, chosen for their skill in recognizing patterns, worked relentlessly to crack it. They were fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and a burning desire for payback. Rochefort famously worked for weeks on end, wearing the same smoking jacket over his uniform, rarely leaving the basement. By the spring of 1942, they had made a breakthrough. They could read parts of the Japanese naval messages. They couldn't read them like a newspaper, but they could piece together enough keywords, call signs, and coded map grids to get a sense of what was happening. In May, they started picking up a massive volume of chatter about a major upcoming operation. The target was designated by the code letters AF. The question was, where was AF? The intelligence community was split. Most officials in Washington, D.C. were convinced AF was in the South Pacific, possibly near Australia, or even the U.S. West Coast. But Rochefort and his team in Hawaii were certain it was Midway. They had seen AF mentioned in context with other known locations, and the patterns just pointed to the tiny atoll. But they needed proof. Washington wasn't buying it. This is where Rochefort's genius for deception came in. He devised a clever trap. He had the U.S. forces on Midway send out a false message in plain, unencrypted English over a channel they knew the Japanese monitored. The message stated that Midway's freshwater distillation plant was broken, and they were running low on fresh water. It was a brilliant piece of what's now called signals intelligence deception. A couple of days later, Rochefort's team intercepted a Japanese message. It reported that AF is short on water. That was it. The smoking gun, there was no longer any doubt. The target was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had only been in command for a few months. He was faced with a monumental decision. His intelligence officers in Washington were telling him one thing. This eccentric commander in a basement in Hawaii was telling him another. Nimitz, in a show of incredible trust and leadership, chose to believe Rochefort. He later said that the victory at Midway was owed in great part to the combat intelligence personnel. Based on this intelligence, Nimitz knew the date of the attack, the Japanese order of battle, and the general plan. He knew Yamamoto was coming. He knew the Aleutian attack was a diversion. He knew everything he needed to know to set his own trap. He couldn't match the Japanese in numbers. He had only 3 carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet to their 4 frontline carriers. But he had the ultimate advantage: surprise. The Japanese were sailing into an ambush, utterly convinced that the American fleet was far away and unaware of their plans. Every decision Nimitz made, from positioning his carriers northeast of Midway to ordering them to maintain strict radio silence, was based on Rochefort's intelligence. Without it, the American carriers would have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the battle would have been a slaughter. The book And I Was There, Pearl Harbor, and Midway, Breaking the Secrets by Rear Admiral Edwin T. Layton, Nimitz's chief intelligence officer, gives a stunning first-hand account of this high-stakes intelligence war. It details the bureaucratic battles and the sheer brainpower required to achieve this feat. The importance of Midway, therefore, isn't just a military story, it's one of the greatest intelligence coups in history. But what critical gaps remain in our understanding? We know about the aft trick, but what other smaller, unheralded intelligence successes contributed to the picture Nimitz saw? How much did the Japanese suspect their codes were compromised, and was there an internal debate about changing them before the Midway operation? And perhaps most chillingly, how many other times in history has a major world event turned on a secret intelligence battle that the public never even knew was fought? Number 13, how do you stop a tidal wave? For 6 months, from December 7th, 1941, to early June 1942, the Empire of Japan was an unstoppable force of nature. It was a military tidal wave that washed over the Pacific and Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed and violence. Nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Consider the timeline. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, they struck the Philippines and Wake Island. They invaded Thailand and Malaya. On December 10th, just 3 days into the war, Japanese torpedo bombers sank the pride of the British Royal Navy, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. It was the first time in history that capital ships at sea had been sunk by air power alone, a terrifying sign of the new reality of naval warfare. One world power's navy was neutralized in an afternoon. The wave just kept rolling. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. In February 1942, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered, a stunning blow to British prestige. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil fields, were conquered. American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were driven into a corner on the Bataan Peninsula and eventually forced to surrender, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March. The Japanese Navy ranged across the Indian Ocean, raiding British shipping and bombing Ceylon. They seemed invincible, a military machine honed by years of war in China, equipped with superb aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, and crewed by the best trained, most battle-hardened pilots and sailors in the world. The Allied response was a series of desperate, costly, and ultimately futile holding actions. The morale of the American public was at rock bottom. The news was an unrelenting drumbeat of defeat. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first time the wave was even slowed. It was a messy, confusing battle, the first in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. The U.S. Navy lost the carrier, USS Lexington, a heavy blow, but they had also damaged 2 Japanese carriers and, more importantly, had forced the Japanese to call off their planned amphibious invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. It was a strategic check, but not a stop. The Japanese were still on the offensive. The Midway operation was designed to be the final, crushing blow. It was intended to eliminate the U.S. Pacific Fleet and seize a forward base that would secure Japan's eastern perimeter for a generation. It was the crest of the tidal wave, poised to break and wash away the last vestiges of American power in the Central Pacific. And then at Midway, the wave didn't just stop, it shattered. It was turned back so violently and so decisively that it would never again regain its momentum. In a single day, the unstoppable force was stopped. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Midway wasn't just a victory, it was a line drawn in the sand. It marked the high water mark of Japanese expansion. Before Midway, the strategic question was, where will Japan strike next? After Midway, the question became, where will the Allies strike next? It was the definitive end of Japan's 6-month blitzkrieg. It proved that the Japanese were not invincible supermen, that their navy could be beaten, and that their strategy could be countered. It was the moment the entire character of the Pacific War changed from one of desperate defense to one of grinding, methodical offense. But troubling questions linger. If Japan had skipped Midway and instead consolidated its gains, could it have created a fortress empire so formidable that the U.S. would have lacked the political will for a bloody island-hopping campaign to defeat it? Was the rapid, unbroken string of victories in the first 6 months actually a strategic weakness, breeding in arrogance and overconfidence, that led directly to the disaster at Midway? And what if the stop had not been so decisive? What if the battle had been a draw, with both sides losing 2 carriers? How would that have changed the timeline of the war? Number 12. Can you lose a war in 5 minutes? The heart of the Japanese offensive power in 1942 was a force known as the Kido Butai, the Mobile Force. It was the most feared and powerful naval strike force on Earth. At its core were 6 of the world's finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku. These were the ships that had executed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. They were fast, they carried a huge complement of advanced aircraft, and their crews were the best of the best. This was the tip of the spear, the instrument of Japan's lightning-fast conquest of the Pacific. At the Battle of Midway, the Kido-Butai was represented by 4 of these carriers: Akagi the flagship, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Shikaku and Zuikaku were absent due to damage and losses from the Battle of the Coral Sea, a crucial factor. Still, the 4 carriers commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo represented an overwhelming concentration of naval air power. They carried over 250 aircraft, ready to strike Midway, and then annihilate the American fleet. The battle on the morning of June 4th, 1942, started out as a disaster for the Americans. The initial attacks on the Japanese fleet were a succession of heroic but suicidal failures. The torpedo bombers from the American carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown went in low and slow. They were slaughtered. Of the 41 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that took part in these attacks, 37 were shot down. They failed to score a single hit. The sacrifice of these men, like Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8, is legendary. He knew they were flying to their deaths, but they pressed their attacks anyway. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain. It had 2 critical effects. First, it pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the defending Zero fighters, down to sea level to deal with the torpedo threat. Second, it forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly to avoid torpedoes, delaying their own preparations to launch a counterstrike. The Japanese flight decks were in a state of chaotic readiness. They were trying to rearm planes, switching from bombs for a second strike on Midway to torpedoes to attack the American ships they had just discovered. The decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and piles of unsecured ordnance. It was a floating powder keg. And then, at around 10:20 a.m., the sky changed. High above the chaos, unseen and unheard, 2 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise arrived over the Japanese fleet. They were led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, who had made a fateful decision to continue searching after not finding the Japanese fleet at its predicted location. It was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. At almost the same moment, another squadron of Dauntlesses from the USS Yorktown also appeared. The Japanese carriers had no air cover at high altitude. The Zeros were all down low. The American dive bombers tipped over and screamed down towards the carriers. In the next 5 minutes, history was rewritten. The Enterprise bombers hit Kaga and Akagi. The Yorktown bombers hit Soryu. The bombs plunged through the wooden flight decks and exploded in the hangars below, igniting the fuel, ammunition, and parked aircraft. The result was catastrophic. All 3 carriers were turned into uncontrollable infernos within minutes. In a book that is now considered the definitive modern account of the battle, Shattered Sword: The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, the authors used Japanese sources to meticulously detail the precise, cascading failures that led to this disaster. It wasn't just luck. It was luck meeting a moment of extreme vulnerability. 3 of the 4 carriers of the Kido-Butai were knocked out of the war in less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee. Hiryu, the lone survivor, would launch a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown, but she too would be found and sunk by American bombers later that day. The importance of this is stark and brutal. Japan lost 4 of its frontline, irreplaceable fleet carriers in a single day. The United States lost 1, the Yorktown. Japan had entered the battle with a massive naval advantage. It ended the battle on the back foot. The Kido-Butai, the terrifying sword of the empire, was broken. Japan's offensive capability was, for all intents and purposes, gone. They could never again project that kind of power across the Pacific. The war was now a fundamentally different equation. But what if the American torpedo attacks hadn't been so perfectly timed to draw the Japanese fighters down? What if McCluskey's gamble to extend his search had failed, and his squadron had run out of fuel and ditched in the sea? And could the Japanese have recovered if only 1 or 2, not all 4, of their carriers had been lost that day? How different would the next year of the war have been? Number 11. What's more valuable than a warship? A warship, even a massive aircraft carrier, is ultimately just a piece of machinery. It is steel, wire, and rivets. It can be replaced. A nation with a powerful industrial base can build another one. It takes time, but it's possible. What is not so easily replaced is the human element, the skilled, experienced, and battle-hardened pilot. And this is where the Battle of Midway delivered its most crippling and perhaps least understood blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. The loss of the 4 carriers was catastrophic. The loss of the men who flew from their decks was fatal. The Japanese naval aviators of 1942 were arguably the best in the world. They were the product of a brutal, hyper-selective, and lengthy training program. A pilot candidate had to be the best of the best to even be considered. The training was incredibly rigorous, far more so than the American system at the time. The result was a small elite corps of pilots with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of flight hours. They were veterans of the war in China. They had perfected the art of naval aviation. They were masters of their machines, particularly the superb A6M Zero fighter. This small pool of elite aviators was Japan's single greatest military asset. They were the ones who had executed Pearl Harbor, sunk the Prince of Wales, and dominated the skies over the entire Pacific. The Japanese system treated these pilots like priceless samurai swords, exquisite, deadly, and irreplaceable. And at Midway, this priceless asset was shattered. When the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu went down, they took with them over 100 of these elite veteran pilots. But it wasn't just the numbers. The Japanese system had a fatal flaw. Unlike the US Navy, which rotated its experienced pilots back home to train the next generation, the Japanese kept their best pilots in combat until they were killed. There was no system to pass on that invaluable combat knowledge. The veterans were the frontline units, and the training pipeline for new pilots was slow and small. When those veterans were lost at Midway, a huge chunk of the IJN's institutional knowledge of naval air warfare was lost with them. They lost not just pilots, but flight leaders, squadron commanders, and tactical innovators. These were the men who knew how to lead a complex multi-squadron strike, how to find a fleet in the vastness of the ocean, and how to survive in the chaos of aerial combat. In contrast, the American system was designed for mass production, not just of planes, but of pilots. The training program was shorter, but it could produce thousands of new pilots. The American philosophy was to get a competent pilot into a good plane and send him into combat, accepting that many would be lost, but that the sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm the enemy. After Midway, the US Navy began pulling its own experienced pilots out of combat to become instructors, ensuring that the next wave of aviators would benefit from their hard-won experience. Japan could not do this. They had lost the core of their talent pool. The pilots who flew for Japan in later battles, like the carrier duels around Guadalcanal, were simply not of the same caliber. They were less experienced, less skilled, and their learning curve in the face of increasingly numerous and skilled American opponents was brutally steep. The historian H.P. Wilmot argued that the loss of the pilot corps was even more significant than the loss of the carriers. Japan could and did build new carriers. They could never again produce pilots with the skill and experience of the men who died in the waters off Midway. The battle didn't just sink 4 ships, it wiped out a generation of naval aviators, but we still have questions. Just how much of a skill gap existed between the average Japanese and American pilot before Midway? And how did that gap change in the months after? Did any high-level Japanese naval planners recognize the flaw in their pilot training and rotation policy before Midway? And were their warnings ignored? And what if a significant number of the veteran Japanese aircrews had been rescued from the sinking carriers at Midway? Could they have formed the nucleus of a new formidable air group on Japan's remaining carriers and changed the outcome of the battles around Guadalcanal? Number 10. Can an entire nation's mindset be a weakness? The Imperial Japanese military of 1942 was one of the most effective fighting forces in modern history. But it was also crippled by a set of deep-seated cultural and doctrinal flaws. It was rigid, arrogant, and suffused with a belief in its own spiritual and racial superiority. This mindset, often referred to as victory disease, was born from a long, unbroken string of military successes. They believed they were simply better warriors and that their fighting spirit, or Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material disadvantage. At Midway, this institutional arrogance proved to be a fatal weakness. It manifested in several critical ways. First, there was the planning. The Japanese plan for Midway, devised by Yamamoto and his staff, was a masterpiece of complexity. It was also a masterpiece of arrogance. It assumed the Americans would behave in a predictable, passive way. It assumed the element of surprise was guaranteed. There was almost no contingency planning. What if the Americans showed up early? What if they knew the plan? Such possibilities were dismissed. The plan relied on perfect timing and execution by multiple, widely separated forces. This is a hallmark of a military staff that has grown overconfident. Like, they believe their plans will work. simply because they are the ones who made them. As the military theorist Karl von Clausewitz warned, everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. The Japanese plan for Midway was the opposite of simple. Second, there was a shocking failure in pre-battle intelligence and reconnaissance. The Japanese launched a plan called Operation K, which was intended to use long-range flying boats to scout Pearl Harbor and see if the American carriers were there. The operation was canceled due to increased American patrols, but the Japanese leadership simply shrugged it off. They launched their main fleet towards Midway with a massive blind spot, having no firm idea where the enemy carriers were. They also arranged their submarine picket line intended to spot the American fleet as it sortied towards Midway too late. Nimitz's carriers had already passed through the area before the submarines arrived. These were not simple mistakes, they were symptoms of a mindset that did not respect its opponent. They didn't think they needed to be that careful. They believed the Americans were demoralized and incapable of mounting a serious preemptive threat. Third, this arrogance showed up during the battle itself. After the first strike on Midway Island, Admiral Nagumo and his staff engaged in a prolonged debate about how to arm the second wave of planes. Should they carry bombs for another strike on the island, or torpedoes in case enemy ships appeared? This indecision, famously documented in Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya's classic, but now heavily scrutinized book Midway: The Battle That Doomed Japan, left the carrier decks in a vulnerable state for a critical period. A more cautious commander, one with a healthy respect for the unknown, might have prioritized finding and sinking the enemy fleet above all else. Nagumo, confident that the American fleet was far away and no immediate threat, allowed himself to be distracted. When American planes did appear, the initial reaction on the Japanese flagship was one of disbelief more than alarm. This arrogance blinded them to the reality of their situation until it was far too late. Midway was a lesson, written in fire and steel, that spirit and past victories are no substitute for good intelligence, flexible planning, and a healthy fear of your enemy. The battle didn't just sink ships, it shattered a deeply flawed military doctrine, but what parts of the Japanese military culture were strengths, and how did they contribute to their initial successes? To what degree was the victory disease a top-down problem from Yamamoto and his staff versus a widespread cultural phenomenon throughout the Navy? And if Admiral Nagumo had been a more flexible, less dogmatic commander, could he have overcome the flaws in Yamamoto's plan and still won the battle? Number 9. What happens when an entire country starts to believe again? The first 6 months of the war were a time of darkness and despair for the American public. The news from the Pacific was a relentless story of defeat, retreat, and humiliation. In Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, the narrative was one of American unpreparedness and Japanese invincibility. People were scared. There was a genuine fear of Japanese attacks on the West Coast. Morale was fragile. The Doolittle Raid in April provided a brief, welcome flicker of good news, but it was clear to everyone that it was a pinprick, not a knockout blow. The country needed a real victory. It needed proof that the Japanese war machine could be beaten. It needed hope. In Midway provided that hope in a way no other single event could have. When the news finally broke, initially censored and released slowly to prevent the Japanese from realizing how much the U.S. knew, it was like a thunderclap across the nation. The initial Navy communique was understated, but the reality soon became clear. 4 of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were at the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese offensive had been stopped cold. The victory was so stunning, so complete, that it was almost hard to believe. It was the Pearl Harbor in reverse that the country had been yearning for. Newspapers ran banner headlines. Radio commentators spoke of a turning point. For the first time, the narrative of the war in the Pacific changed from one of Japanese dominance to one of American ascendance. The impact on the home front was immense. It galvanized public support for the war. It boosted war bond sales. It gave factory workers, who were just beginning to ramp up America's massive industrial production, a clear sign that their labor was making a difference. The men and women building the ships, planes, and tanks now knew that their work was arming an American military that could, and would, win. The story of Midway, as it was told to the public, was a story of American courage and ingenuity against overwhelming odds. The heroic, albeit suicidal, attacks of the torpedo squadrons became legendary tales of sacrifice. The success of the dive bombers was hailed as proof of American skill and determination. It created a new set of heroes and a new confidence in the U.S. Navy. This morale boost was just as important as the strategic victory. Modern wars are not just fought on the battlefield, they are fought in the factories and in the hearts and minds of the civilian population. A nation's will to fight is a critical strategic asset. Midway solidified that will in the United States. It erased the sting of Pearl Harbor and replaced it with a sense of righteous confidence. It provided the psychological foundation for the long, brutal years of war that were still to come. Without the morale supercharged from Midway, the dark days of the Guadalcanal campaign that followed might have seemed unbearable. But with Midway as a recent memory, the American public was prepared for a long haul. They now knew, with certainty, that Japan could be defeated. The book Victory at Sea by James D. Hornfisher powerfully captures the sense of a nation's mood turning, showing how the news from the front lines directly influenced the spirit of the home front. But we have to ask some difficult questions. How much did the U.S. government manage the news of the victory, and what details of the battle, like the initial catastrophic losses of the torpedo squadrons, were downplayed to maximize the morale boost? How did the perception of the battle by the American public differ from the colder, more complex reality understood by naval strategists? And if the battle had been a loss, or even a costly draw, could American public morale have sustained the will to continue the fight in the Pacific with the same determination? Number 8. How does victory change your enemy's mind? Just as the news of Midway sent a surge of confidence through the United States, it delivered a profound psychological shock to the Japanese military and government. This was more than just a military defeat, it was a spiritual blow. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost a significant naval engagement since its formation. Its modern history was one of unbroken, almost mythic victory. The belief in their own superiority was not just propaganda, it was a core tenet of their identity. And in a single afternoon, that myth was shattered. The Japanese government's reaction was to hide the truth. The scale of the disaster was so immense, so unthinkable, that they could not allow the public to know about it. The survivors of the sunken carriers were brought back to Japan in secret, isolated in naval hospitals, and forbidden to speak to anyone, even their families, about what had happened. They were quickly reassigned to remote outposts to prevent the story from leaking. The official government announcements claimed Midway as a great victory. They reported that Japan had sunk 2 American carriers and established control over the area, while admitting to the loss of one of their own carriers and damage to another. It was a complete fabrication, one of the great lies of the war. This secrecy itself is a measure of the battle's importance. The truth was considered too devastating for the Japanese people to handle. But within the highest echelons of the Navy, the truth was known, and it was crushing. For Yamamoto, it was a personal and professional catastrophe. The decisive battle he had engineered to destroy the American fleet had instead destroyed his own. The book A Glorious Way to Die, the Kamikaze Mission of the Battleship Yamato, shows how the shadow of Midway hung over the Japanese Navy for the rest of the war, a constant reminder of their lost supremacy. For the naval planners and strategists, Midway forced a horrifying realization the war was not going according to plan. The short, victorious war they had hoped for was now impossible. They were now locked in a war of attrition against an industrial giant that they knew they could not defeat in the long run. The pre-war simulations and predictions made by men like Yamamoto that Japan had to win quickly or it would lose were now coming true. The psychological impact on the frontline forces was also significant, though it took time to filter down. The myth of the invincible Kido Butai was gone. The sense of unstoppable momentum was replaced by a grim, defensive reality. The battle created a before and after in the minds of the Japanese Naval Command. Before Midway, their strategy was offensive, ambitious, and expansive. After Midway, it became defensive, reactive, and focused on conservation of their dwindling forces. They had lost the strategic initiative, and they knew it. This shift in mindset was as important as the loss of the ships themselves. A navy that has lost its confidence is already halfway to being defeated. Midway didn't just sink 4 carriers, it sank the spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But what if Japan had told its people the truth about the defeat at Midway? Would it have shattered national morale, or would it have stiffened their resolve for a total defensive war? How did the surviving pilots and naval officers who knew the truth process this cognitive dissonance between reality and official propaganda? And to what extent did this crushing secret defeat contribute to the increasingly desperate and fanatical tactics, like the kamikaze attacks, that Japan would employ later in the war? Number 7. What does a victory actually let you do? A victory in a single battle is only as important as what it allows you to do next. Midway was the definitive turning point because it handed the strategic initiative in the Pacific War from Japan to the United States. It cleared the board and allowed the US to stop just reacting to Japanese moves and start making its own. The first and most important consequence of this was the ability to launch the Guadalcanal campaign. Before Midway, any thought of a major American offensive was pure fantasy. The US Navy was outgunned and on the defensive, desperately trying to protect the vital supply lines to Australia. But the victory at Midway, by crippling the Japanese carrier fleet, dramatically changed the strategic calculus. The naval playing field was suddenly level. It wasn't that the US was now overwhelmingly dominant, but the existential threat of the codebreakers wiping out the American fleet in a single battle was gone. This created a window of opportunity. Admiral Ernest J. King, the famously aggressive U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, was determined to seize this new initiative and go on the attack before Japan could recover. He wanted to hit them before they could fortify their new defensive perimeter. The target chosen was an obscure, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain that almost no one had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. The Japanese were building an airfield there. If completed, that airfield would pose a grave threat to the sea lanes connecting the U.S. to Australia. King and his planners decided they had to take that island and that airfield. On August 7th, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. This would have been unthinkable before the victory at Midway. Committing America's precious few carriers and amphibious forces to an offensive in the South Pacific, while the full might of the codebreakers was still roaming the seas, would have been suicidal. Midway made it possible. The Guadalcanal campaign was a brutal 6-month slog of jungle warfare and vicious naval battles fought in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. It was a meat grinder that consumed men, ships, and planes from both sides, but it was a fight the U.S. was now able to wage. The naval battles around Guadalcanal, like the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, were tough, costly fights. Both sides lost carriers and other warships, but the crucial difference was that Japan was fighting with a badly wounded carrier arm. They were missing the 4 carriers and the expert pilots lost at Midway. The U.S. was fighting with the confidence and the strategic freedom that Midway had provided. In his definitive histories of the Pacific War, such as the Two-Ocean War, historian Samuel Eliot Morison emphasizes that every strategic decision made by the Allies after June 1942 was made possible by the foundation laid at Midway. It was the Gateway victory that opened the road for the long, island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead to Tokyo. So, Midway's importance isn't just about the ships sunk on June 4th. It's about the landings on Guadalcanal on August 7th. It's about stopping the Japanese advance and immediately starting the American counterpunch. It was the pivot point that allowed the entire U.S. war strategy to shift from defense to offense, setting the pace and the location of the next phase of the war. Without Midway, there is no Guadalcanal campaign in 1942, and without Guadalcanal, the entire timeline of the Pacific War is different. But did the U.S. move too quickly to the offensive after Midway, before it was fully prepared, leading to the near disasters and heavy losses of the early Guadalcanal campaign? Could Japan have still won the war of attrition around Guadalcanal even after their losses at Midway if they had committed their remaining forces more decisively? And what alternative offensive strategies did the victory at Midway open up for the Allies that were considered but ultimately rejected in favor of the Solomon Islands campaign? Number 6, can a country's factories win a war? This war is not just a matter of tactics and courage. It is also a matter of economics and industrial production. In the long run, the side that can build more planes, more ships, and more tanks and can replace its losses usually wins. This was the fundamental strategic reality of the Pacific War. Japan was a heavily industrialized nation, but its capacity was dwarfed by the sleeping giant of the American economy. Admiral Yamamoto knew this better than anyone. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington and had seen America's industrial might up close. His entire strategy was based on this knowledge. Japan had to win a decisive victory early in the war before the American industrial machine could get into high gear. He famously warned that if the war dragged on, he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. The first 6 months of the war were Japan's window of opportunity. They had a temporary military superiority, and they used it to seize the resources they needed. The goal was to create a defensive fortress so strong that the U.S. would find the cost of breaking it too high. Midway slammed that window shut. The battle was so important because it bought the United States what it needed most time. The victory at Midway, by leveling the naval playing field and stopping the Japanese advance, prevented a knockout blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It created a strategic pause, and during that pause, the American factories began to roar to life. Consider the numbers, which are laid out in detail in Richard Overy's book, Why the Allies Won. In 1942, the U.S. built over 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, that number jumped to over 85,000. In 1944, it was over 96,000. Or Japan, in contrast, built around 9,000 in 1942 and peaked at about 28,000 in 1944. The disparity was even more stark with naval vessels. After the devastating losses at Midway, Japan struggled to replace its 4 lost carriers. In the entire war, Japan built only a handful of new fleet carriers. The United States, on the other hand, embarked on a shipbuilding program of unprecedented scale. The Essex-class carriers, which would form the backbone of the U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces later in the war, were already under construction. 17 of them would be commissioned during the war. They were bigger, better, and more technologically advanced than their Japanese counterparts. The U.S. also mass-produced smaller, light carriers and escort carriers by the dozens. Midway was the crucial turning point because it held the line until this flood of new equipment could reach the front. The victory ensured that there was still a U.S. Pacific Fleet to receive these new ships and planes. If the American carriers had been lost at Midway, the Japanese would have had naval dominance in the Pacific for at least another year, perhaps longer. This would have given them the time to fortify their island conquests, potentially invade Hawaii or Australia, and make the eventual American counteroffensive infinitely more difficult and costly. The victory at Midway was a firewall. It stopped the immediate threat and preserved American naval power in the Pacific just long enough for the overwhelming weight of American industrial production to come to bear. The heroes of Midway were not just the pilots in their cockpits, but also the workers on the assembly lines in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego. The battle ensured that their work would not be in vain. But what if Japan had focused its own limited industrial capacity more on mass-producing aircraft and training pilots, rather than on building super battleships like the Yamato and Musashi, which proved to be of little use? To what degree did Japanese strategic planning account for America's industrial potential, and did they have any realistic plan to counter it beyond hoping for an early decisive victory? And how close was the U.S. industrial mobilization to being too little too late if the Battle of Midway had been lost? Number 5. What if your best weapon is luck? Military history is filled with stories of brilliant strategy and heroic sacrifice, but sometimes the outcome of a battle hinges on something far more unpredictable, pure dumb luck. While the victory at Midway was certainly a product of incredible intelligence work and profound courage, it was also the result of a series of fortunate coincidences and lucky guesses that are almost unbelievable in hindsight. The Americans didn't just win, they got incredibly, astonishingly lucky. The first piece of luck was the survival of the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. It was estimated that it would take 3 months at the Puget Sound Navy Yard to repair her. But the U.S. needed every carrier it could get from Midway. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor, thousands of shipyard workers swarmed the ship. In a monumental effort, working around the clock for 72 hours, they patched the ship up just enough to get it back into the fight. As historian Craig L. Simons notes in his book The Battle of Midway, this was a miracle of repair work. If the Yorktown had not been available, Nimitz would have had only 2 carriers to face Nagumo's 4. The odds would have been even longer. The second, and most famous, piece of luck happened in the air on the morning of June 4th. The American airstrike against the Japanese fleet was a mess. The different squadrons from the 3 American carriers got separated. The torpedo bombers went in alone and were annihilated. The dive bombers from the Hornet, led by their commander, completely missed the Japanese fleet and turned south, effectively removing them from the most critical phase of the battle. That left the dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Wade McCluskey. They too arrived at the predicted location of the Japanese fleet and found nothing but empty ocean. McCluskey was faced with a critical choice. Like his planes were running low on fuel. The safe textbook decision would have been to turn back towards his carrier. But McCluskey made a guess. He reasoned the Japanese might have changed course, and he decided to initiate a box search, gambling his and his men's lives on a hunch. He turned northwest. After several agonizing minutes of seeing nothing, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which was speeding to catch up to the main fleet after having tried to depth charge an American submarine. As McCluskey made another fateful decision, he decided to follow the destroyer's wake. That wake led him directly to the Kido Butai at the precise moment of its greatest vulnerability. If McCluskey had turned south instead of northwest, or if he had decided to play it safe and go home, or if the destroyer Arashi had not been in that exact spot at that exact time, the American dive bombers would have found nothing. The course of the battle and the war would have been completely different. This chain of events is so unlikely it feels scripted. The Yorktown's miraculous repair, the uncoordinated American attack that inadvertently drew the Japanese fighters down, McCluskey's intuitive gamble, and the perfectly timed appearance of the lone Japanese destroyer, it all had to happen exactly as it did. The Japanese had their own share of bad luck, of course, from the delayed submarine picket line to the ill-timed scout plane report that spotted the American fleet. But the American luck on that day was simply extraordinary. This is a crucial part of Midway's story. It's a reminder that war is not a chess game. It is a chaotic, unpredictable affair where chance and circumstance can play as big a role as any grand strategy. But what do we still not understand about these moments? What was the real debate on McCluskey's radio channels as he made his decision? Was it as much of a lone guess as the legend holds? How many other lucky or unlucky small events, like a malfunctioning engine on a scout plane or a misinterpreted radio signal, might have had an unrecorded but significant impact on the battle's outcome? And is it possible that what we call luck is actually the cumulative effect of better training and doctrine that allows individuals like McCluskey to make better intuitive decisions under extreme pressure? Number 4, did Midway prove one-weapon supremacy? For centuries, the ultimate symbol of naval power was the battleship. With its massive guns, thick armor, and imposing silhouette, it was the undisputed queen of the seas. Naval strategy was built around the battleship. The goal was to bring your line of battleships into a decisive gunnery duel with the enemy's line. But a new weapon had been emerging since World War I air power. Visionaries like Billy Mitchell in the United States had argued passionately and controversially that airplanes could sink battleships, making them obsolete. By the start of World War II, the debate was still raging. Most navies, including the US and Japanese navies, were still built around the battleship, with aircraft carriers seen as a new, useful, but perhaps supporting weapon. Pearl Harbor was the first major blow to the battleship's supremacy. The Japanese carrier planes had devastated the American battleship fleet at anchor. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse by Japanese aircraft just a few days later was the second blow, proving it could be done to ships at sea. But Midway was the final, definitive nail in the battleship's coffin. The Battle of Midway was fought and won entirely by aircraft. The main surface fleets of the two opposing sides, which included some of the most powerful battleships ever built, like Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, never saw each other. They never fired their main guns at an enemy ship. They were irrelevant to the outcome. The battle was a duel between carriers, fought by their airborne proxies, hundreds of miles apart. The weapons that decided the fate of the Pacific were not 16-inch shells, but 1,000-pound bombs and aerial torpedoes delivered by fragile single-engine aircraft. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber in particular emerged as the star of the battle. This unassuming plane, which was considered slow and somewhat obsolete even at the time, proved to be an incredibly effective and precise ship killer. In those critical 5 minutes on June 4th, the Dauntlesses did what entire fleets of battleships had dreamed of doing for a century. They annihilated the core of an enemy's naval power. As detailed in books like The First Team Pacific Naval Air Combat from Pearl Harbor to Midway by John B. Lundstrom, the skill of the pilots and the effectiveness of the dive bombing technique were the decisive factors. After Midway, there was no longer any serious debate. The aircraft carrier was now the undisputed capital ship, the new queen of the seas. The battleship was relegated to a supporting role, primarily as a floating anti-aircraft platform to protect the precious carriers, or for shore bombardment. Naval strategy was completely rewritten. The future of naval warfare belonged to the Carrier Task Force, a mobile airbase that could project power across vast oceans. This fundamental shift in naval doctrine is one of Midway's most enduring legacies. The U.S. Navy embraced this lesson wholeheartedly, building its war-winning strategy around its fast carrier task forces. The Japanese, who had ironically pioneered many of the techniques of carrier warfare, learned the lesson in the most brutal way possible. The battle was a validation of a new way of war, proving that a single pilot in a single plane could now sink a billion-dollar warship, forever changing the calculus of power on the high seas. But lingering questions remain. If Japan's battleships, particularly the super battleship Yamato, had been used more aggressively at Midway, could they have engaged and destroyed the American carriers after the initial air battles? To what extent was the success of air power at Midway dependent on the specific circumstances of that battle? And could battleship-centric fleets have still been decisive in other types of naval engagements? And did the total focus on carrier aviation after Midway lead navies to neglect other important areas like submarine warfare or logistics in the later stages of the war? Number 3. What if Hawaii had fallen? The tiny 2-square-mile patch of sand and coral known as Midway Atoll seems an insignificant prize for which to risk so much. But its strategic location was critical. It lies about 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, Hawaii. In the hands of the United States, it was a vital forward sentry post and refueling station, a picket fence for the defense of Hawaii. In the hands of the Japanese, it would have been a dagger pointed directly at Pearl Harbor and the entire Hawaiian island chain. Yamamoto's plan wasn't just to sink the American fleet. A key part of the operation was the seizure of Midway Atoll itself. Had the naval battle gone the other way, the Japanese invasion force, following close behind Nagamo's carriers, would have certainly overwhelmed the small contingent of U.S. Marines defending the island. The consequences of a Japanese-controlled Midway would have been dire for the United States. With a major airbase on Midway, the Japanese could have launched bombing raids against the naval base at Pearl Harbor and other strategic targets in Hawaii. They could have conducted reconnaissance that would have made any U.S. naval operation from Hawaii nearly impossible to conduct in secret. Pearl Harbor, the most important American base in the entire Pacific, would have been effectively neutralized. It would have become untenable as a forward base for the Pacific Fleet. The fleet would have been forced to pull back its main operations to the west coast of the United States, to bases in San Diego and San Francisco. This would have been a strategic catastrophe. It would have ceded the entire Central Pacific to Japanese control. It would have added thousands of miles to the supply lines for any future American offensive. The logistical challenge of fighting a war across the Pacific, which was already immense, would have become nearly insurmountable. Furthermore, a Japanese base on Midway would have exposed the U.S. West Coast itself to the potential for raids. While a full-scale invasion was unlikely, the psychological and political impact of Japanese bombers over California would have been enormous. It would have caused panic and diverted huge amounts of military resources to homeland defense, resources that were desperately needed for offensive operations. The victory at Midway, therefore, did more than just win a naval battle. It secured the American defensive line in the Central Pacific. It guaranteed the security of Hawaii as the critical forward base for the remainder of the war. Every major campaign in the Central Pacific, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was launched from or supported through the naval base at Pearl Harbor. None of that would have been possible if Midway had fallen. The battle slammed the door shut on Japan's eastward expansion and eliminated the most serious threat to American territory during the entire war. The defense of that tiny atoll had an importance far out of proportion to its size. It was the shield that protected America's ability to project power and ultimately win the war. But some questions are still debated by historians. How realistic were Japan's long-term plans for Midway if they had captured it? Did they have the logistical capability to support and defend such a remote outpost against an inevitable American counterattack? Was an actual invasion of Hawaii ever a serious strategic consideration for Japan, or was the threat primarily a way to draw the U.S. fleet into a decisive battle? And if the U.S. had been forced to abandon Pearl Harbor, could they have effectively prosecuted the war from West Coast bases, or would it have forced a Germany-first strategy in which the Pacific became a secondary, holding theater? Number 2. Who was the unsung hero of the Dauntless? While Midway was a story of admirals and codebreakers, the decisive action came down to a handful of men in the cockpits of their planes. And the plane that won the Battle of Midway was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. The SBD officially stood for Scout Bomber Douglas, but its pilots had another name for it, Slow but Deadly. It was not a glamorous aircraft, it wasn't as fast or as agile as a fighter, but it was rugged, reliable, and it was an exceptionally stable and accurate dive-bombing platform. And at Midway, it proved to be the single most effective weapon on the battlefield. Its counterpart, the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, was a death trap. It was slow, poorly armed, and its torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. The heroic but futile attacks of the devastator squadrons at Midway highlighted the complete failure of that weapon system. In contrast, the Dauntless performed its mission with lethal precision. The technique of dive bombing was terrifying and demanded immense skill and courage. The pilot would push his plane into a near vertical dive from high altitude, aiming his aircraft directly at the target ship, ignoring the storm of anti-aircraft fire coming up at him. At the last possible moment, he would release his bomb and then pull out of the dive, subjecting himself to crushing G-forces. It was a high-risk, high-reward method of attack, but it was incredibly accurate. At Midway, this accuracy was what mattered. The Dauntlesses that attacked the Japanese carriers scored a remarkably high number of hits. A single 1,000-pound bomb dropped from a Dauntless was enough to pierce a carrier's unarmored flight deck and detonate in the hangar below, turning the ship into an inferno. One pilot who exemplified the skill and courage required was Lieutenant Richard Dick Best. He was a squadron commander from the USS Enterprise. During the battle, he may have achieved a feat unmatched by any other pilot in the war. He is credited with scoring a direct hit on the carrier Akagi in the morning attack. Then, later in the afternoon, flying a different plane, he took part in the attack on the last remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu, and is credited with scoring another direct hit that helped seal its fate. To score a fatal bomb hit on two separate enemy carriers in a single day is an almost unbelievable accomplishment. Unfortunately, the strain of the battle and a faulty oxygen canister activated latent tuberculosis in Best's lungs, and he would never fly in combat again. His story and the story of the Dauntless is a powerful reminder that wars are often won not by the most advanced technology, but by the right weapon in the hands of the right people at the right time. The importance of the Dauntless's performance at Midway was profound. It validated the American naval doctrine of dive bombing, which the U.S. Navy had invested in heavily. It cemented the SBD's reputation as one of the great naval aircraft of the war. The Dauntless would go on to sink more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft during the entire war. Midway was its finest hour, the moment when this workhorse of a plane, flown by ordinary men who became heroes, single-handedly changed the course of the war. The battle was the ultimate proving ground for a weapon and a tactic that turned out to be perfectly suited for that one decisive moment. But how much did the specific design features of the Dauntless, like its perforated dive brakes, contribute to its success compared to the skill of the pilots who flew it? Why was there such a massive discrepancy in the effectiveness of America's dive bombers versus its torpedo bombers at this stage of the war? And if the Japanese carriers had possessed armored flight decks, like their British counterparts, would the bombs from the Dauntlesses have been far less effective, potentially changing the outcome of the battle? Number one, did it all hinge on the turn of one man? When you strip away all the grand strategy, the intelligence reports, and the industrial statistics, the Battle of Midway boils down to a series of critical human decisions made under unimaginable pressure. And perhaps no decision was more important than the one made around 9:55 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey. He was leading the 32 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers of Air Group 6 from the carrier Enterprise. They were running out of fuel. They were over an empty ocean. They had missed their target. His orders were to return if the enemy wasn't found at the predicted intercept point. The safe, prudent, and professionally correct decision was to turn back. But McCluskey made a different choice. This single moment is, for many historians, the absolute crux of the battle. It is the pivot upon which everything else turns. We consider the stakes. If McCluskey turns back, his squadron, the most powerful single-strike group the Americans have in the air, finds nothing. The dive bombers from the Hornet have already missed the target. The torpedo bombers have already been wiped out. The only remaining American strike force of consequence is the smaller group of dive bombers from the Yorktown. They do find and attack the carrier Soryu, but it's very possible that in this alternate scenario, the other three Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Hiryu, survived the initial attacks unscathed. They would have then been able to launch their massive prepared counterstrike against the American carriers. With a 3-2 or even 4-2 advantage in operational carriers, the Japanese would almost certainly have won the ensuing battle. The American fleet would have been crippled or destroyed, and the battle and potentially the war would have been lost. But McCluskey didn't turn back. He gambled. He made an educated guess that the Japanese fleet was behind schedule and to the north. His decision to continue the search, to push his planes and his men to the absolute limit of their fuel and endurance, was an act of incredible faith and determination. And when he spotted the wake of that single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, and made the second critical decision to follow it, he set in motion the chain of events that led to the destruction of the Kido Butai. As laid out in stunning detail in works like Miracle at Midway by Gordon W. Prange, this moment was the culmination of everything that had come before: the code breaking, the strategy, the sacrifice of the torpedo pilots. But all of it would have been for nothing without McCluskey's decision. It was the spark that lit the fuse. This is perhaps the most astonishing and human reason for Midway's importance. It teaches us that history is not always an inevitable tide of great forces. Sometimes it is a fragile, contingent thing that can be changed by the choice of a single individual in a single moment. The fate of nations, the lives of millions, the entire course of the 20th century's largest conflict may have hinged on one man, low on fuel, thousands of feet over the Pacific, deciding to turn left instead of right. It is a profound and humbling reminder of the power of individual agency in the midst of chaos. The victory was a team effort, but it was a team that was given its chance to win by the stubborn refusal of one man to give up the search. But the most shocking questions are the ones we can never truly answer. What was truly going through McCluskey's mind? Was it cold calculation, pure intuition, or something in between? How much pressure did he feel from the other pilots in his squadron as their fuel gauges dropped towards empty? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how many other moments in history have there been, completely unknown and unrecorded, where a single small decision by an ordinary person had the potential to change the world, but the coin flip just happened to land the other way?